Hey you guys, it's Carolyn from Homesteading Family, and we're at our local antique store, and we're going to be talking about choosing cast iron, whether it's modern brand new cast iron or antique cast iron. We're going to talk about how to choose what's right for you, what to look for, and what to avoid. All right, you guys, before we head out antique shopping, we're going to talk a little bit about the 4 different types of cast iron and how to know what you want to buy for your kitchen, what's going to be the most usable for you. Now, this is going to be the first video in a series of videos on cast iron, so keep your eyes out for the upcoming videos on seasoning cast iron, maintaining it, and even some cooking. All right, so let's get right into it. Now, for all practical purposes, there are 4 types of cast iron. You have your antique cast iron that was made through the 1800s all the way up until about the mid-1900s. Then you have your modern rough cast iron, you have your modern smooth cast iron, and of course you have your enamel coated cast iron. Now, back in the 1800s until about the mid-1900s, we made cast iron differently. We made it with a much finer sand in the cast, and we made it with a process that is now not economically viable for most businesses. So that means your old antique cast iron, brands like the Griswold and the Wagner, those have a really, really smooth interior finish. Here is a Wagner that I've had in my collection for a while, and it's a very, very smooth bottom finish. Another thing about antique cast iron is it's also much lighter to use than the modern cast iron pieces. That's because of the way that they used to mill it, they used to make it and cast it. So this makes a much lighter piece. It makes a much more usable piece in the kitchen because you can get it almost completely non-stick. Okay, now what happened is that somewhere around the 1950s, we ended up with OSHA regulations, believe it or not, and this absolutely changed the cast iron industry because the fineness of the sand that was used to cast the iron pieces up in this time period was so fine it was causing health problems for the people working in the cast iron factories. So now there's regulations that say we have to use a larger sand. So we get what's called the modern rough cast iron. Now these pieces are heavier, they're actually significantly heavier, and if you look at them up close, the surface of them is much, much rougher. That's whether or not it has been seasoned. You're gonna have a much rougher finish on this. This is why most of this type of cast iron is currently sold pre-seasoned, so they can do a really good factory seasoning on it for you to help make it a little bit more non-stick, but it's never gonna be the same as that antique stuff. Now, these are brands like Lodge and Victoria, and one of the benefits of them is that, well, 2 of them, they're really accessible, they're all over the place, they're pretty easy to find, and they're fairly inexpensive because they can be made on this mass scale and they don't require a whole lot of extra work in the factory. Okay, now then there is this new class out that's called the modern smooth. This is kind of taking this modern rough idea and trying to make it a little bit more like those antique cast iron pans. They're usually still just as heavy as the modern rough, but they're much smoother. That usually involves a machine smoothing process. And this would be a piece like this. This is a new piece that we just found. It is very heavy. You can see the outside of it is very rough still, but the inside of it is actually been machine smooth. So it is much smoother than, say, that Lodge piece was. The problem with these is they're incredibly expensive. A lot of times a pan like this will cost $200 to $300. These are the pans that you can find from Butter Pat Industries, Finex. You can find it from, gosh, you know, they're coming out with quite a few new kind of artisanal brands that have this modern, smooth finish. Now, of course, your last one is your enamel covered pieces. Now, this is a Le Creuset that we've had in the family for many, many years. Lodge is now coming out with a line of enamelware. And these are really handy. They're really good to have on hand if you plan on doing much with acidic sauces like a tomato sauce, where you're going to have a lot of acid sitting in your pan for a long period of time. Now, a quick bit of acid in a normal unfinished cast iron pan won't be any problem if you have a good seasoning coating on it. But if you plan on doing a lot of simmering, long simmering of acidic sauces, you really want to stay away from your unfinished cast iron pieces. It can actually destroy your seasoning over time. So that's where something like an enamel cast iron piece really shines and is really, really helpful. Another place is if you plan on doing a lot of water boiling in your pot. That kind of water boiling can start to deteriorate your seasoning on your unfinished cast iron, but in an enamelware pot, it should be just fine. Now, the most important thing about this enamelware is that you get something that's high quality, because if you get a low quality or cheaper piece, the enamel will start flaking on it and putting enamel pieces into your food, and before long it just isn't even usable. So stay away from that, save up a little bit extra and buy a good quality piece. Now, we're not going to be talking a lot about this enamelware in the rest of the video, but you can see that really the best way to go is to try to find your antique quality unfinished cast iron to start. You're going to get a really good usable finish where it's nearly non-stick, and usually you can find the pieces for really cheap if you keep your eyes open at local yard sales, thrift stores, antique stores, things like that. So it's really a great way to go if you're just getting started or you want to add a few good pieces to your collection. If you don't have access to good locations like that, like an antique store close to you, then you may want to start off with just one of those modern rough pieces. But let me say, if you are planning on buying your children a wedding gift to get started, get them a set of this modern smooth, spend the extra money on it. It will last for generations and it's wonderful to cook on. Okay, so we are going to get ready to go to the antique store and go shopping. So we'll see you at the antique store. Okay, so here we are at our local antique store. There's big trucks going by all right in front of here. And I love an antique store like this because honestly, not only does it have these great old antiques, but it has a lot of modern junk as well. So you kind of have to rifle through things, you have to sort through things, but a lot of times you can find some absolute treasures in a place like this. Now, when you're shopping for cast iron in a place like this place, you have to remember a few different things. And one is that most of what you're going to find is probably going to be that modern rough cast iron. That's because we've been making that on a large scale for about the last 70 years. So it's what's really out there. The other thing that you have to realize is that name brands don't end up meaning anything when you're working in the kitchen. So don't get caught up looking for those Griswolds or those Wagners for those old antique pieces. What you need to look for is the texture and the usability of the pan. And I'm going to show you all about that inside. All right, I get really excited when I see piles of cast iron like this because that usually means that there's going to be something good hiding in a pile. You know, one of the first things you have to think about when you're buying cast iron is you want to get your base foundation pieces that you need first, which means that you really want a skillet, you want a Dutch oven, maybe you want like a deep-sided fryer. You need to get those pieces first before you start getting all the fancy pieces that you can't use as much. It's important to know what sizes you want before you come into an antique store like this, because once you get here it gets confusing. There's so many fun things to look at, so many neat things to see. So for a family of 4 or less, you should probably go with about a 10-inch sized skillet. And you really don't need anything over a 5-quart Dutch oven, most likely. For a larger family than that, you probably want to go with a 12-inch skillet and at least a 5-quart Dutch oven, if not larger, maybe a 7-quart. So here we are, and we're going to look at some of these different types of cast iron. Now again, remember, the name brand doesn't mean a whole lot when it comes to the functionality, but it can give you some hints as to whether something is new or old. Now this one right here, I can tell right off, this piece is like something out of antiquity. It is very coarse. It is incredibly heavy. And I can just tell that this is not at all smooth. It's almost pitted, even though it looks brand new. And you know what? It actually is. This is a brand new Polydine pan. And this thing is like a monstrosity. Like, you don't want this in your kitchen. This is gonna be too heavy to be functional, and it's not gonna ever be smooth enough, even with seasoning, in order to really be nonstick. Okay, so, oh, I can almost not set that down with one hand. It's so heavy. Now, we have another one here, and this is probably a more modern piece, but I want you to look at the inside. It is really, really smooth. Can you see that? There's no light pitting, no bumpiness to it at all. If you compare that to that Polydine pan, it's an entirely different finish. Now, this is gonna go ahead and clean up beautifully. When you're looking for a piece like this, you need to look on the inside. There's a little bit of rust. A little bit of rust is okay, but if you end up with any spots that's really rusted, you just can't use that. You don't want anything that has any deep pitting in it, because you won't be able to season that out. The only way of fixing that would be re-milling it or machine smoothing it. You don't want to have to get into that. And the other thing that you have to be really careful about is that it hasn't warped. The way to find that out is by setting it down on a very flat surface and just seeing if it wobbles. If there's any wobble in it, you don't want to touch it. It probably means it's been misused or mishandled, overheated, or put into some cold water when it was too hot. And you really don't want to get into that problem. When you look at the bottom, you need to know your different type of stoves. If you're cooking on a gas propane stove, then a little ring around here is just fine. But if you're cooking on anything with a flat top, you'll need to make sure it's an entirely flat bottomed pan. Okay, now I already own way too many skillets, so I'm gonna keep looking around and see if I can find myself a good Dutch oven. This is a really good example of a really bad job on seasoning on a pan. If you can see right here on the edges, there's all of this black kind of gunky stuff that looks like it could flake right off. When you're choosing cast iron, that's actually not a problem, because we're going to clean all the seasoning off anyways and start fresh. So if it's just the seasoning that's gone bad on a pan, you don't have to worry about it. This pan is a great example of a very, very smooth bottom pan. And as long as it passes that wobble test and there's no chips or deep pitting, then we should be great to pick a piece like this, as long as it's in your price range. And we can get it cleaned up just fine at home. Okay, I was thinking that this Dutch oven might be the piece that I wanted. I love the domed lid, and it's actually really smooth inside, although somebody's done a really bad seasoning job in it and it's sticky. But then I did the wobble test. Take a look at that. That is completely warped and completely wobbles. It'll never sit flat on your stove, and it won't heat properly because of that. All right, this is a Griswold Dutch oven, and I was really excited about it when I saw it from the outside, but when you look on the inside, it's really deeply pitted. It's like somebody probably left this outside for a long time. This is not gonna be usable for anything good in your kitchen. You don't wanna buy something like this. Okay, so I didn't have any luck finding a Dutch oven that I wanted, but I did find this deep-sided 9-inch skillet. It passed all the tests on making sure that it's a good one to buy. There's no deep pitting. The seasoning on it is awful. We're gonna have to strip this down. And it is only about $18. So I'm gonna get this and probably use this for summer cobblers, because a deep pan like this is a lot of fun for a quick pie or a cobbler. Okay, I found a few other goodies, so I'm gonna go check out with this and all of those things that I found. And I'm gonna meet you back in the house where we're gonna talk about the next steps with this. All right, that was a lot of fun. I love getting to go antique shopping. Look at all the treasures that I found. Check out this great stoneware bowl and some really usable baskets. That's a really nice one. Of course, I'm always looking for stuff like wooden spoons. I love having wooden spoons. I don't think you can have enough of them. And then check out this really fun kind of oxen cast iron platter that I found. It needs to be re-seasoned, but it's going to be really cute hanging on the wall. And then, of course, our pan. So the next steps that we're going to want to take on this is to strip off all of this old seasoning and then to re-season it and get it ready to use. So watch for the next video on stripping it and seasoning it. It should be out in the next few weeks.